And thank you all for the invitation, and it's so wonderful to be here and I guess get to talk about wet forest. And so I'm gonna share screen and share a lot of pictures, I think. Okay, are folks seeing that?
Yep, that looks good.
Awesome. So before I get started, I want to acknowledge the lands and the areas that I've had opportunities to work and study and visit, and acknowledge the historical and current and future stewards of the lands. And specifically acknowledge the location I'm sitting in right now, which is at the University of Minnesota on the Twin Cities campus, and acknowledge those lands and acknowledge what those lands are, and especially what those lands are in relation to the Mississippi River and the confluence of the Mississippi and Minnesota River, which hold great significance to multiple indigenous group and tribal sovereign nations. Thank you, and thank you all again for being here. And I want to just quickly acknowledge what I'm sharing today is not just my work, but the work of so many people and so many collaborators, and that acknowledging their work, their collaboration is critical to all these pieces moving forward. And so before I kind of move into some of the data and some of the results and some of these pieces, I kind of want to take you through what led me to this journey and kind of give you a little bit more background about me. So Connor mentioned I did my BS and MS at Michigan Tech, and I spent a lot of time in hardwood forest, and those are mostly mesic forest, lots of nutrients, and also lots of vegetation. So lots of broadleaf species, and especially in the fall, these beautiful colors that come from them. And then that took me out west to high elevation forest, including forest damaged by spruce beetle. Some of my favorites in the high elevation, including those 5-needle pines that I know folks here also really enjoy. And then these lower elevation kind of woodlands. And so coming back, having the opportunity to get a job at the University of Minnesota and kind of come back to Lake States, I thought I'd be spending more time in the pines, specifically like red pine and these upland ecosystems, or even some of these hardwoods. But my first week on the job included a 5-day tour across Minnesota. And so these were just the stops that, like, where we were staying in the major cities, included 15.5 hours of driving. That didn't include any of the driving outside of the major cities into the forest and meeting with all these different organizations and tribal sovereign nations and potential collaborators. So over those 5 days, I got to meet with many of the different organizations that work in forest resources and natural resources in Minnesota. And I got to see some amazing long-term studies and amazing investments, both on the Cutfoot National Forest and the Marcel, the Cutfoot Experimental Forest and the Marcel Experimental Forest. And these are amazing, great centers that have just provided so much data and so much resource in terms of long-term data. There was also another one that we drove by, and one of the foresters from the Minnesota DNR mentioned, "Hey, I think I've seen some of these signs in the forest. I think there's a long-term experiment station there, or there's an experimental forest there, and I think some stuff has come out of there in the like 50s and 60s." And so that kind of piqued my interest. And so this is the Big Falls Experimental Station, Big Falls Experimental Forest in Big Falls, Minnesota, so way up north. And you can kind of see assets, none. cooperation, some in the past, needs, none, critical needs, none, long-term needs, none. So it was this experimental forest that had been established, in partnership with the Minnesota DNR, and had produced these great experiments in black spruce and these other wet conifer systems, these lowland conifer systems. And so I was driving around with this Minnesota DNR forester, and then one of our stops was with the Forest Service, and then they mentioned, yeah, I think we have some boxes, and by boxes they meant a whole room full of data from that experimental forest that really hadn't been touched since the 1970s. And so this is one of the maps, and if you kind of look up in that left-hand corner, you can see the transparent paper that was typewritten as well. And so this just piqued my interest. And it also, as a new professor, it also reminded me, like, those long-term data can be a wealth of information. And my predecessor, Tony D'Amato, really made a lot of work come out of those long-term data that are the permanent plots and the long-term data from the Cutfoot experimental forest. And that was what was there with the Big Falls experimental forest. So it seemed like there's opportunity for someone starting out to utilize this resource that had been invested, this data that was sitting there, including boxes of information, to potentially explore something. That also then aligned well with some of the needs that stakeholders and forest organizations mentioned. So Minnesota has some of the most amount of boreal and these peatland forests in the continental United States, so not including Alaska. There's a lot of these conifer forests, and they're actively managed. And one of the main organizations that is managing these forests is the Minnesota DNR. And so for the last 10, 20 years, they've been working on trying to understand how these forests develop, how these forest systems are organized, also how we manage these forest systems. So these are actively managed forest systems. And so there's a Tamarack assessment report. There's forest management plans related to peatland forests that began in 2014. So I began this position in 2015. And then also thinking about how we designate lowland conifer old growth, and what does that mean in terms of what are the processes, what are the stand development, what are the stand dynamics that relate to these forests over multiple decades and centuries as they develop, and what are old growth characteristics. And then layer those needs of, this is a system that's managed, this is a system that's relatively understudied. So 1970s and 80s were really the last active period of research in these lowland conifer forests from the United States perspective, from like the Minnesota area, very much acknowledging Canada and Ontario, and lots of provinces in Canada are active researchers and active managers of the boreal forest. The Minnesota forests are just a little different, as well as those in parts of Wisconsin and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. And then you layer on top of this need, these are actively managed, providing multiple ecosystem services. With climate change, it is and has been impacting these systems and will continue to impact these systems. So as we think about managing them now and also managing them in the future, there's a lot of questions that were still so unanswered. And so that kind of led me to really diving into these systems as a potential system that could be really interesting, and a potential system that had unanswered questions that managers needed some advice and wanted to collaborate on the system. So I want to touch on one of the species that I'll be really focusing in, which is black spruce. So black spruce has this transcontinental range, and it represents about 10% of Minnesota's forests. And they're often grouped in these kind of lowland or peatland forests in the north and north central. And they're extremely ecologically important, from carbon storage to wildlife habitat for multiple species, from the spruce grouse to multiple migratory warblers, including some of those that are of special concern for Minnesota and broader regions, as well as Minnesota is often called the land of 10,000 lakes. I don't know the exact number, but I know it's more than 10,000. And part of that piece involving water quality and this aspect that is sold in terms of the recreation potential relates to clean water. And that means maintaining healthy forests for that water filtration, maintaining those pieces from the aesthetic and recreational view, as well as spiritual value that these forests provide many different people. And so black spruce, so those of you who are used to working with slightly faster growing trees, mature trees, we're talking a diameter of 5 to 8 inches. So that's our mature trees in these systems. So they're extremely lower productivity, slower growth, heights of between 25 and 85 feet. And our site index is around 20 to 60 feet at 50 years. So a huge potential range too, in terms of that productivity and in terms of stand growth processes, which relates back to, as we think it like as organizations such as the Minnesota DNR begin to tackle what does old growth characteristics look like, it's going to be a very broad range for on that lower productivity side. If we're talking about 20 feet, potentially 2 or 3 inches in diameter at 50 years, that's going to be something very different than on the higher productivity side. So average max age is around 200 years. They can grow longer, and our rotation age varies between 60 and 120 years. And these are commonly managed using a clear cut or strip cut silvicultural system. So that rotation age is about 60 to 120 years. They're clear cut in the winter to maintain, one, to maintain access, and two, to be done on frozen ground to maintain the soil structure of the peatland systems. After they are harvested, a common method is aerial seeding. So there's really good contracts between the Minnesota DNR and pilots. And so these stands are aerial seeded at a few ounces per acre. And due to the growth, due to the productivity, due to a lot of things, there's not a lot of intermediate treatments. So, and there also is some other questions too, since they're aerial seeded, sometimes the regeneration checks are aerial. So these stands may only have a person entering them, potentially for a forest inventory if that needs to be updated, but more realistically, when a harvest is being set up. So there's potentially this huge, what there is this large gap of information of how these stands go from regenerating and seeing like, check, 5 years, we've got great regeneration, to what happens in the next 55 to 115 years between that rotations. How are they developing and what does that look like? And so that's been one of the questions, is thinking about that stand development and thinking about how stand development processes might also reflect alternative or different silvicultural systems. So whether that be a shelter wood, whether that be single tree or selection methods, including single tree or group selection, or variants of the clear cut. So whether that be a patch or a strip clear cut, or how that looks. And even thinking about thinning, which is not at all commonly done currently, but thinking about how these pieces fit together is really where this study that was established in 1948 gives us some options right now. So this is commonly called the Compartment Study and was established on the Big Falls experimental forest in 1948. And like I said before, it's this collaboration between the Minnesota DNR and the US Forest Service. And their goal of the study was thinking about extending the present supply, so really from a timber focus, but really importantly, also ensuring regeneration. So thinking about how these sites regenerate, how these stands develop, and how these pieces fit together. With the goal of, like many of these studies that were established around that time period, comparison and demonstration. And you can see the signage, we've really been keeping it up in Minnesota here on how well these are signed and how often people get out here. And so this study had really an interesting range of silvicultural treatments, including clear-cut strips, clear-cut patches, a shelter wood, and a true shelter wood. So it was harvested in multiple steps, including reducing the basal area to about 50 square feet, and the overwood was removed 10 years later, so a true shelter wood. As well as 2 uneven age methods, including a group selection and what they called a tree selection, which very much fits kind of a single tree selection, as well as some intermediate treatments such as thinning. The thinning was only implemented once, as well as the group selection and the single tree selection. Those were only implemented once throughout the time of the experiment. And so here's some kind of key measurements. So started in 1948, the first kind of harvest begins in that 1950s. And we got starting to get that shelter wood regeneration cut. And our final clear cut harvest started in 1960 or ended in 1968. So this was an active experiment, active site between 1950 and 1966. And then almost 50 plus years later, one of my graduate students co-advised with Dr. Matt Russell, went out there in 2017 to reopen these studies and re-examine these measurements. And so when the experiment started in the 1950s, close to over 35,000 trees were measured, and lots of paired measurements. So we have these paired 10-year measurements, and all treatments were repeatedly measured. However, by the time we were out there in 2017, some of the experiments were harvested. So we lost some of the treatments, including those group selection and single tree selection and the thinning treatments. But the treatments that remained were the clear cut patches, the clear cut strips, and the shelter woods. And so while it was a loss that we didn't have those treatments, the treatments that we did get to remeasure are options that are more likely to be implemented by forest managers today and actively and managed in a more operational sense compared to, it would be super interesting to think about group selection and single tree selection and these thinnings, but those probably are not going to be operationally feasible, whereas thinking about a shelter wood or a clear cut in these different variants very much could be operational and could be a small tweak to the current system. And so I mostly just want to, I'm not going to run through this, but just kind of setting this up for where we are. And you'll notice these are in English units. So we published this in Forest Science, and we asked to keep the English units. That way there was direct comparison to the older studies that were published in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So these all can be traced back and use the same units that the original scientists and authors were using. So showing this, I just want to highlight the kind of range of where we're working with, in general, site index in that kind of 40 to 50 range, age anywhere from 100 to 135. Basal area was relatively consistent, as well as trees per acre. but those folks that also have the opportunity and privilege to work with these longer term studies, there can be some high variability when we talk about these studies that were established decades ago. And so I think just acknowledging that there is high variability, and one of the strengths that we have is the length and the permanentness of these plots. But some folks may be very critical of the experimental design, and that's really fair. So there's been a lot of changes over the last 50 or 60 years as we think about how we set up experiments and the pieces that we try to aim for. And so with this kind of data, we were able to explore both these kind of short-term and longer-term pieces. So Brian Anderson, who was the student, was co-advised, like I said, with myself and Matt Russell. Matt Russell has a really great quantitative background. And so we started looking at these growth models and thinking about how trees grow over time. And I'm not going to go into this. This is not my area of expertise, but we did develop diameter increment models and looked at those across these multiple treatments. And so we're able to feed this information into the FES modeling system, which was really not performing well for black spruce, since those of you that work with FES, the forest vegetation simulator, know that that breakpoint between overstory and understory trees is right around 5 inches, which is our average size of black spruce. So really adding this information helps us think about how these systems grow and how they develop over time. And so I'm going to go back away from the modeling and the diameter growth models and think about how these changed long term. And so we lost a few plots, and so we lost a few treatments too. So what we have is the shelterwood, the clear-cut strips, and clear-cut patches, as well as kind of variation in the number of plots that we had left. But we felt confident that we were able to have enough plots to speak with some confidence of like how these trends or how we were seeing these development. And so one of the pieces is like the basal area and the trees per acre, they're relatively similar. So but where we start seeing some differences is diameter. So those shelterwood, we're seeing a larger diameter tree, again, 5.8 compared to 5.4 and 5 inches for the clear-cut strips and clear-cut patches. And again, note, so 67 years after treatments, we have trees between 5 and 6 inches in diameter. So, but the piece that's really exciting that kind of continued, really piqued my interest was this idea of how species composition shifted after 67 years. And this was really an open question. So seeing the shelterwood shift the species composition. So we have in that kind of pink salmon color, we have black spruce, we have tamarack in kind of the golden color, balsam fir is green, white pine is blue, aspen is a darker blue, and paper birch is purple. We see these clear-cut treatments, the clear-cut patches and clear-cut strips. We have mostly black spruce and mostly tamarack. And that's pretty consistent with the current management. A very high favor on black spruce with some minor components of tamarack. And with the shelterwood treatment, seeing the shift and seeing paper birch come in across diameter classes and being able to see slight changes and adding an additional species, and one that's not accounted for, but one that's a broadleaf, provides opportunities and provides options for thinking about how and maybe why we manage, or even why, like what those goals are. And so from this really piqued the interest of like, wow, there could be some options out there. There could be some range of how these forests are managed, and especially thinking about resilience and then thinking about climate change and how these pieces maybe fit together both at the stand and landscape and within and across organizations. And so one of the things that became of interest as we were studying this long-term data set was one of the main disturbance agents is eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe. And this mistletoe is a little different than many of the western mistletoes. It causes mortality. So on average, a black spruce infected with mistletoe will die within 17 years of infection. And the general treatment is a clear cut and some kind of buffer strip around there. But this is the main disturbance agent in black spruce, and the Big Falls Experimental Forest didn't have any. So this was another piece that we began to explore, is like, okay, how is disturbance interacting in this forest type? And what we saw was really interesting in that in the system, when we have no evidence of eastern spruce bush mistletoe, we have these really unimodal diameter distributions of black spruce or Pima, so Picea or Picea mariana in the white, and we have dead black spruce in the black, and then mistletoe black spruce in the gray, live larch in the green, and these other dead and other live species. And so that unimodal diameter distribution of these stands that are commonly managed using even age systems kind of fits the bill. Really high proportion of one species, unimodal diameter distribution. But as we get this disturbance agent, we get shifts in that species composition, and we also get shifts in how that diameter distribution is allocated. So with this high mistletoe, higher percent of mistletoe and higher severity of mistletoe, one, we see a lot more dead trees, but we also see a shift in kind of eastern larch and other species being able to come in. And what I'm not going to go into detail, in this lower severity level, we see the potential for trade-offs in light environment, this gap dynamics, and the shift in species being able to come in. And so with that, we've started to talk about utilizing the triad approach that Dr. Robert Seymour noted, is like, there could be potential different ways that we manage black spruce and still maintain the disturbance dynamics, maintain the ecological complexity of the systems, while still maintaining productivity. So some of these sites are going to be managed for the production of timber. Black spruce is the second most harvested pulpwood species in Minnesota, and some of these lands are school trust lands that are mandated for the maximum economic return from the lands to the school trust. And then there's also lands that are managed for wildlife and within wildlife management areas. But there can be a whole broad range of, as we think about how these disturbances interact and how these disturbances create different gradients and different opportunities for species, that maybe thinking about not only shelter woods reserves, but also the role that mistletoe plays as a native disturbance agent may provide different opportunities to think about species composition. And so we've continued to dive into this through a chronosequence approach. So that Big Falls allowed us to go really deep and long-term with these permanent plots, but they opened a lot more questions. And so with state funding, we were able to establish a chronosequence across these different types of peatland forest and these different ages across the state. So my researcher, Laura Ruling, and as well as collaborators, Dr. Robert Slezak and Dr. Alexis Grindy, and our students and our researchers have put a whole lot of miles the last 3 years across the state of Minnesota, establishing a network of 48 plots where we're measuring the vegetation, we're stem mapping trees, we're collecting tree cores. We also have these instrumented for hydrology and water, as well as Dr. Alexis Grindy is doing bird counts and point counts and small mammal trapping. So really trying to capture the a more holistic assessment of these sites in terms of how they develop and how they're being utilized at different stages of stand development to, again, inform and think about how we manage or why we manage. And so coming back to that trip, so peatlands was one of those forest types that kind of continually came up, was of continual interest. The other one was ash, and seeing these extensive areas of black ash wetlands across central and northern Minnesota sparked a lot of questions, especially as EAB continued to spread across the Twin Cities, and recently was established in the Duluth area along the North Shore. And so there's over 200 million ash trees larger than 5 inches in dBH, and across 1.1 million acres of forest land. And so you can see EAB is continuing to spread, and there is some hope related to cold tolerance and potential for that. And while that may decrease some of the spread and decrease some of the impact, the climate trends are not in favor of colder winters, rather warmer winters. And so emerald ash borer girdles and causes widespread mortality, and has caused widespread mortality. On its own, it will move about 1/2 to a half mile to a mile a year, but due to anthropogenic spread, it's moved really across the eastern and starting to move into that western portion of areas where ash is. And so I guess one of the things I like to do, and I think is go back to these management handbooks and these older documents from the 70s that really dived into the silvics and thinking about the species. And so one of the management guides talks about black ash really regenerate on and are really dominant on these sites with organic peats and mucks. And these are sites that they're really, really able to be the only competitor. That's where they're left. And if we manage with clear cuts, that doesn't end well, and there's swamping and these other aspects. And these are really common sites across Minnesota, these peatlands, these mucks that ash occur on, black ash. But there's also sites that are slightly better. So on slightly better drain sites, they're more abundant, more diverse. Here, black ash, it is the dominant species, but there might be other species occurring with it. And so there's been a lot of great research on black ash and on black ash specifically in those wet sites. And so a piece that seemed to be missing is, what about on those better sites? We know there's a lot of different black ash stands, and we've seen management is kind of limited on some of the wet sites. What about on those stands that are maybe more mesic? And so working with many different forest management organizations, we did a retrospective study of black ash stands that were dominated by black ash and were harvested between 07 and 13. And some of those were harvesting using a clear cut system that included some kind of richer site, so some kind of mesic hardwood inclusion, and some more poorer sites. So we had a clear cut rich and a clear cut poor, as well as a diameter limit. And I'm going to be very, we put this only as a silvicultural system so we can group them together. And there's lots of notes of how diameter limit harvesting is not a silvicultural system. So saying that again, as well as group selection. And so these retrospective studies, they have a lot of limitations, but they do allow us to look at how forests were actively managed and be able to see where they are in that development process. And so we collected a lot of data, and one of them included depth to muck. So we collected overstory data, regeneration, understory composition, all kinds of stuff. And this depth to muck, so this muck is the soil that's organic and not well drained. And those of you who have had the opportunity to work in muck, it's just this boot sucking sound that as you walk through it, you can feel yourself sinking into the soil. Or here you can see field crews traversing very wet areas. We now have boats in my lab, inflatable boats, as well as life vests to get across some of these areas that are bigger, things I did not think I would have in a silviculture lab. And so what we found was after regeneration is happening, and those crews that got sent into these sands, they could tell the difference. So this is a clear cut rich sand. And there was a lot going on. So they measured everything above 1 inch in diameter compared to those pour stands. So without that mesic hardwood, they very much were not fans when they saw that this was coming up on their schedule to sample compared to this, because it was a very different amount of trees they were sampling within a 1/10 acre plot. We also sampled within the groups, and those groups were really variable based on some of the site quality and site characteristics. And so one of the things is like regeneration is happening. We've got tons of regeneration happening, but that regeneration is different. And so depending on the site and depending on the site quality, we saw differences in that populace. So aspen, including quaking and trembling aspen, as well as balsam poplar. On those clear-cut rich sites, we were getting over 1,000 stems per acre between 1 and 5 inches in diameter in this retrospective study. So we were establishing the site, and these were not the dominant species beforehand. Black ash was, but after a clear cut, they were able to regenerate it in droves and potentially maintain that site compared to the clear cut pour, where we see lesser amounts, and then also a shift kind of, and also how much of that black ash. So thinking about maintaining that species into the future as well. And so the other piece that was really helpful was thinking about that relationship to the below ground with the above ground. So as the depth to muck, so as we got more muckier, we got less aspen regeneration and we got more black ash regeneration. And so thousands and thousands of stems over 1 inch of these aspen species. But we also observed that instead of potentially needing to measure overstory or the vegetation, we could think about measuring soils. And so these stands are wet, and I think there's about 1,000 mosquitoes to every aspen stand in here, or every aspen stem in here. So they're wet, they're buggy, and they're not really places foresters are like super keen to go in the summer when they could be working in upland hardwoods or pine systems. So sending a forester out here and saying like, hey, look at the vegetation and let me know if you think a clear cut could work here, compared to, hey, keep walking and see how mucky the site is with a soil probe, or see how we use rebar. So walk around the site with rebar and see how far this sinks in. That could be an easier sell, especially if you're have interns like many of these organizations do. That could be an easy sell for an intern to do, to get you data that you would need to think about what kind of situation you could get if you're prescribing a clear cut to try to regenerate these stands, try to get some diversity. So regenerating on a slightly more mesic site, less peat, richer soils, get you options compared to swamping out your site, potentially shifting this from a forested stand to an alder or open brushland. So these are options as we think about how we're going to manage over 1 million acres with a beetle that has 100%, close to 100% mortality rate in black ash. So site matters. Again, it can help you move. And there's been a lot of work across many organizations, and one that was recently done last year was through the Wisconsin Tribal Conservation Advisory Council. So folks that are interested in learning more about black ash or black ash management, this is a great set of seminar series. And so wrapping up, and I think staying mostly on time, wet forests in the Great Lakes are super variable. And they're really relatively understudied in terms of that Western science perspective, and thinking how we understand them, how they develop, and how they're going to be developing in not only current conditions, but as we think about climate change and consider climate change for adaptive management. These are also actively managed systems. So these are actively being managed. Black spruce is the second most harvested pulpwood species in Minnesota next to Aspen. And so there's many things that we're doing that we may not fully understand how a decision now can impact other aspects of the ecosystem services that we are needing to consider. And again, lots of impacts. And so with that, I can take questions and comments or areas we want to dive into.
Thanks, Marcella. We'll see if anyone posts something in the chat. So feel free to post your questions in the chat, or you should be able to unmute too if you want to ask the question aloud. You're welcome to do so. Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, hi, Marcella. This is Tom Kolb. I'm a faculty member here in forestry. I really enjoyed your presentation, and it was just wonderful to be taken to such a wet, mucky place for a few minutes. My question has to do with just what the climate models and projections are about the muckiness of that region, given the apparent strong controls of muck on forest composition.
Yeah. So so the climate models are expecting slightly wetter conditions. However, the timing of that precipitation is going to be more variable, with greater high intensity storms are likely. And we're also expecting increased winter temperatures, and our winter temperatures are expected to warm faster than our summer temperatures. So we're expecting longer growing season. So there is a lot of concern related to drought stress. Even though we're expected to get more water, our growing seasons are going to be longer as well. So our shoulder seasons are going to extend, and the time between these periods are going to extend. So there's some thoughts that in these peatlands, given these are not water limited systems, productivity could potentially increase. But at the same time, with that increased productivity, there can be really big consequences related to below ground carbon storage, which is maintained through these very waterlogged and slow decomposition systems. So I know there's some great work going on in many different systems, but especially in Alaska, in how that trade-off between above and below ground productivity is happening. We also, in Minnesota, we have the Spruce experiment that's funded by DOE, I believe. And they're seeing with high warming over a very short time period, extreme loss of extreme mortality in the overstory trees, and also they're seeing that respiration happen. So they're actually seeing their experiments shrink down, and so this is one of those questions that's really kind of unknown of how the below ground processes, which are so defining of these forests, may influence above ground forest dynamics and vegetation dynamics.
Kristen, you can go ahead and unmute.
Okay, great. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Marcel. That was really great. I have a question about the long-term black spruce trial.
Yeah.
So what were the original stand dynamics and disturbance regimes? I'm just curious that you found those differences in species compositions in the different units.
Yeah. So the disturbance regimes of these systems, they were dominated by stand replacing fires, and those stand replacing fires could be variable. They could be as often as 60 to 100 years, or longer time periods. So we have less well understood fire histories than you all in the Southwest. and especially for these systems. So, but fire was the main stand replacing disturbance for these systems, and they were high to mixed severity and stand replacing. And so there's not a lot of details in terms of how the stands pre-harvest were developed. But one of the things in all these cases with black spruce that just continues to amaze me is not only on the Big Falls experiment, but like in this one related to black spruce and eastern spruce dwarf mistletoe, all these stands were described as black spruce dominant forest. And so the potential for multiple species to come in, I think, is really underestimated in these systems, because we've got pictures of oaks coming in, and we had no idea where that came from. And birch is such a light-seeded species, but there just seems to be a high amount of potential if the light environment is right, and if the timing is right, and all these things. It just seems like still a wide range of unknowns of how those pieces all fit together in terms of how stand development works, or what processes really allow different species to dominate under different time periods. So I don't know if that was a wholly satisfying answer, Kristen, but I think it's a topic that I could spend a career, and others could too.
Thanks, Marcella. No, I appreciate you speculating about it, and it sounds fascinating, and I look forward to your future research on the topic.
We've got a question in the chat from Jim, who asks if you were involved in the open-topped chamber study in the bog at the Marcel Experimental Forest.
No, I'm not. I'm pulling up the picture. So we use it for the National Advanced Silviculture workshop. So Randy Koka gives a great presentation there, but I am not involved in it. So it's these great open top chambers. It's a multi-million, if not, it's a lot of money that's been invested in these chambers. And so they are warming them and they are looking at them. So I'm not involved in that research, but we've been talking about how we link what they're finding in this one specific experiment at this one specific site that's so highly instrumented. And if there's ways we can use this broader network that we've established across Minnesota to think about how these pieces kind of relate to other forest systems or across a range of conditions, and also think about how these changes that they're seeing with temperature and carbon dioxide, how we can start linking those in terms of how we think about forest management or alternatives that we could test out in terms of hoping to create different avenues or greater resilience as climate change does happen in the region.
This might be a bit of a sidetrack question, but I'm curious if you can tell us a bit about like what site or stand factors contribute to dwarf mistletoe intensity.
That's another area that that we're trying to figure out or trying to explore. So there's been a lot of research related to the pathology side of it, and especially the pathology side that this mistletoe kills its host, which is just an interesting aspect of this mistletoe. So there's been a lot of work related to the pathology and like how it kills its host and what that looks like in the timeline. And also some of the research from a very economic lens in mistletoe, resulting in the loss and mortality of black spruce and how that then relates to economic impact from the harvest. But in terms of like how that relates to stand and site and stand and landscape features, that's unknown. So I have a current graduate student, a current PhD student, who that's what she's starting to explore at landscape scale. So using the forest inventory data as well as our inventory data from the state to see if there's any relationship between site characteristics and the mistletoe. And so she's had some luck thinking about age. So age has kind of become a consistent variable, with older stands being more likely to have mistletoe. But it's very much an open door. And I think one of the pieces where we're seeing is something that's been underestimated likely is the distribution of mistletoe by avian species and other animal species into different locations. And so I think that's a whole potential different avenue for research too.
Cool, thank you. We have any other questions for Marcella? Looks like we've got another question from Jen. Black ash still has major significance to the indigenous people of that region, I think. Have you been involved in any possible work with the tribes on trying to protect black ash from EAB?
Yeah, no, it's hugely significant, and there's no replacement for this species in terms of basket making and other culturally significant ways of utilizing this species. So there's no replacement for that. So there is work related to genetics and thinking about genetically resistant trees. There's work in preserving trees through multiple methods for future artists, future knowledge holder, to share that knowledge, to share that history. But it's been a big question and a big concern, and one that's not monolithic, and one that has a range of ideas. And so that Wisconsin seminar series through there we go, Wisconsin Tribal Conservation Advisory Council, they have a whole host of talks that relate to not only the use, but also thinking about indigenous practices in terms of resistance and resilience, and the pieces that different tribal sovereign nations are advocating for or utilizing on their lands, or working collaboratively with different land management organizations across the historical and lands that are part of their history and their culture and their stewardship. And so there are organizations and tribal sovereign nations that are looking and planting different species in hopes of proactively diversifying some of their black ash forests. Because a piece that's also related to that is many of these forests may be adjacent to wild rice lakes. And so the loss of black ash or the loss of forest cover could then also influence the ability for those lakes to provide wild rice and provide that relative to them. So there's a very complex relationship to multiple species, and how those how certain decisions relate to different trade-offs. Yeah, thanks for the suggestion, Kyle. That's a great person to reach out to.
Is there any resistance breeding for black ash for EAB? I know they're doing it with a lot of the other ash species that occur further to the south, but I don't know that I've heard anything about black ash.
I don't know the answer to that question either. I know there's been trials introducing Manchurian ash, and that's not been well received from multiple land managers and multiple organizations. So I don't know the status of any genetic testing or genetic breeding related to black ash. But if others on the seminar or on the talk do, I'd be great to hear too.
We've got time for probably one or two more questions if anyone has any. Alrighty, I think we can call it a seminar then. Thank you so much, Marcella. That was an awesome talk, and it's been really fun to hear from folks who are way outside of the Southwest and learn about new forest communities. So if everyone could, please, if you want to unmute, feel free to give a round of applause or do the clapping emoji.
Thank you.
And I just posted a link in the chat to the post-seminar discussion. We can start that. We'll do like a 10-minute break, so we can start that at 5:10 if that's all right with you, Rich.
That's fine with me. Thanks. Look forward to it.
Awesome. Cool. Thank you so much, Marcella. Were you able to get the?
Yep, I'm just gonna grab that now.
Cool.